Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Quiet Riot. Hello, Quiet Rioters. It's me, Naomi, here with a mini-cast deep dive to keep you satiated until the next weekly show. Between the terrible attack in Southport, subsequent riots across the country, the Chancellor's statement about a $22 billion black hole, worrying escalation of tension in the Middle East, and of course, let's not forget the Olympics, there's one story that isn't getting quite the coverage it would in more normal times: the Conservative Party leadership race. Pre-election, there was much chatter about the direction the party might take after Sunak. Would they feel compelled to move further towards the Reform UK agenda, to embrace Trustonomics again, or perhaps deepen their social conservatism credentials? Well, with nominations now closed, we have a slightly clearer idea of what the answer might be. Mel Stride, James Cleverly, Priti Patel, Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat and Robert Jenrick will battle it out before the first MP vote reduces their numbers to 4, and again to the final 2, who will then need to win over the party faithful. Helping me to understand the people, the processes, is someone who knows the runners and riders and tribes within conservatism far better than me. It's acting editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Henry, welcome to Quiet Riot.
Thank you for having me on.
While the other parties sort of get a chance for a summer break, the Tories are still in the thick of it. Have you managed to have any time off yet?
I'm having a week.
Good.
Starting yesterday, and that's my first week since March, I think. So I need to try and find time for some more at some point.
You do, Henry, and that is incredibly kind of you to join us today, if technically you are
right.
On a week off. Let's go first for our listeners with the process. So can you sort of give us a TLDR on what's going to happen and when, nomination numbers, timings, when will we know who's in the top 4, the top 2, and when the kind of grand finale will be?
Yeah, sure. So the basic mechanism of Tory leadership contest since 1998 is that the MPs whittle it down to a final 2, and then the party members choose between those 2. But there's a lot of room for playing around within that basic format, and we've seen that this time. So the 1922 committee, which is a quite prestigious, historically famous group of backbench Conservative MPs, has decided on the rules of this contest, and they're slightly different to what I think I and many other people were expecting. Because what happened is we had the opening of nominations, and we had 6 candidates come forward. Each of them needed a proposer and a seconder who were public, and then 8 private nominators, and that's fine. But then they decided to have all 6 candidates campaigning throughout August, fine. Early voting of MPs in end of the first week, second week of September. I can't remember the exact date, but I think September 9th it starts. Mm-hmm. And that narrows it down to the final 4. Now, this is the slightly odd thing. Everyone I spoke to beforehand assumed that the MPs would narrow it down to the final 2 at this point. But they're not. They're narrowing it down to the final 4. The final 4 will go to Conservative Party conference, end of September, start of October. Then MPs will whittle it down to a final 2. After that, there will be members voting throughout October, and we'll have a new Conservative leader on November 2nd.
So do the MPs have to be in Parliament to vote? Is that part of the sort of the timetable difficulty, that there isn't much sitting time of the House of Commons after the summer break before the conference recess?
There would be enough. No, the reason that they've decided to split it up this time officially is in order to have the 4 candidates at party conference. The thing that's slightly puzzling is why they're doing that, because the members are at party conference, or a lot of members are, and so it would make sense to have the final 2, because the final 2 are the people between whom the membership will be voting. Yeah, right, exactly. Whereas currently, you're going to send 4 of them, potentially, and then the members will get to know them, and the members might decide that they like, candidate X or candidate Y. And then the MPs are going to have another round of voting that takes 2 of those people off the ballot. It's a quite slightly strange structure.
And then, of course, within that time period, we're also going to have Rachel Reeves's first Chancellor's budget. I think that's now on the 30th of October, meaning that there won't be a new leader's appointment for Shadow Chancellor to reply to that. What do you think? Is that also a bit of a misstep, or is it right that Hunt gets to do his kind of final hurrah against Reeves before then resetting it all with a new shadow cabinet later in the year?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things that will probably only become truly apparent in retrospect, and then everyone who didn't take a firm decision beforehand can pretend that's what they thought was going to happen. I think it's a misstep. Hunt does have the advantage of having been Chancellor, and responding to the budget is one of the hardest jobs as an opposition, Shadow Chancellor or Shadow Leader, is one of the hardest jobs in British politics. So he has the experience to do it. But the challenge is, and I think personally this far offsets that, is that he's just lost the election.
Yeah.
I don't think he's a credible message carrier with the voters for criticising Rachel Reeves' agenda. And we saw this with the recent row over the 22 billion black hole. I actually think Hunt, reading that row, Jeremy Hunt had a point. We can get into it or not if you want, but he really did have a point about the slightly sort of sketchy nature of the claim that there was this 22 billion hole that needed to justify lots of breaking manifesto commitments. But no one's listening because he literally just lost the election. So I think the Conservatives, might regret having no leader in place for that, no shadow cabinet, no shadow chancellor in place for that. And then, just 3 days after their leader is announced, we're going to have the American presidential election. So that's going to be like a complete sort of news nuke.
Indeed.
Because
normally you would expect a new leader bounce, wouldn't you? You'd expect a little bit more airtime, leading to polls maybe shifting back in their favour a little bit. But there seems like there's going to be some missed opportunities to really get that cut through if you were in place in time for something as grand as the budget.
Yeah, exactly. You're giving Labour 3 months in which to set the narrative around the previous government, which the Tories should know is a very dangerous thing to do, because they did it very, very effectively after 2010. With what they did to the Brown government and the narrative they established about the crash. So it's extraordinary. But you're right. The other thing I think a lot of Tories don't really realise yet is how hard life in opposition is, because a huge share of Tory MPs have entered Parliament at or since the 2010 election.
Our listeners will be familiar with Priti Patel and James Cleverly because they've held one of the great offices of state. I suspect many will know of Kemi Badenoch and Tom Tugendhat, who also have had relatively high profiles because of their briefs and position within the party. Fewer, I'm assuming, could pick Mel Stride or Robert Jenrick out of a lineup. So, Henry, if it's not too reductive, a question, can you give our listeners roughly where you might put them on a Conservative spectrum, where you would place them in relation to each other? Sort of right to left, or one
right
nation
to right. So right to left. So I can. The interesting thing about this exercise is I can do it. I might then have to go into some detail about why I think it's not especially helpful, but it is doable. So left to right. Also, the thing is, especially when it comes to placing the one at the left, whichever one it is will be really irritated by my decision and probably tell me. So
I'm not sure they'll listen to the show, don't worry.
Fair. Well, their advisors might. So we have basically 3 candidates on the left of the spectrum and 3 candidates on the right of the spectrum. We have Tom Tugendhat, Mel Stride and James Cleverly, left side. We have Priti Patel, Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch, right side. On the left, Tom probably has the most sort of one nation reputation, but his voting record is often not as one nation as his reputation is.
Right.
So I would maybe say that he was to the right of James Cleverly, and then Mel Stride, I think, probably splitting hairs between him and Tom Tugendhat. He was the Work and Pension Secretary who had the big thing about the economically inactive, which we have seen Alan Milburn take up in the current government. But broadly, they're on the left. And then on the right, this is, again, quite an interesting contest. I'd say the most right-wing candidate is probably Priti Patel, in terms of vibe, general, where people think she is. The big sort of offset to that is that she was Home Secretary when Boris Johnson decided to use his post-Brexit points-based immigration system to massively liberalise immigration, which is something I think she'll struggle with. And then you've got Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. And the interesting thing here is that, on the one hand, Kemi is a very vocal and often very articulate right-winger on cultural issues. But some right-wing MPs are concerned about the fact that they have, until this leadership contest, not really heard her say a thing about economics. Is she actually low tax? Is she actually wanting a smaller state and all the rest of it? Robert Jenrick started life as a Cameroon.
Well, indeed, I remember him being a Remainer in the referendum.
Yeah, absolutely, and he was a Remainer, and so he started there, and he has moved rightwards, and especially given his time in the Home Office, especially having been charged with trying to deliver the Rwanda policy. He basically resigned from the government because he thought that the way Rishi Sunak was trying to do the Rwanda policy wouldn't work, and that turned out to be correct. So I think, again, we would slightly be splitting hairs between these three groups if I organised them into a complete 1 to 6. But I think that where Robert is more interesting is that he, on Rwanda and on housing under Boris Johnson, is, in government, he had a reputation for really taking a tilt at very difficult jobs when he was offered it, which includes really sort of hardline immigration policies like Rwanda. But I would say the useful thing in terms of left-right is that basket of three and that basket of three. How you order them
within those
inside that is a pretty open process.
Quiet Riot. I want to sort of ask about that sort of jostling and shifting of position. We've already seen Tom Tugendhat shift his position on ECHR membership, that he would be prepared to take the UK out of it. Now, presumably that's to try and shore up the right flank of the party, who maybe see him as being a more of a left candidate. Do you think we might see a candidate in that other basket, more perceived to be of the right, do similar in the opposite direction? Like, could we see Patel calling for, I don't know, a youth mobility visa with the EU to bring over some pro-Europeans, or even, dare I say it, newly rejoined member David Gauke?
That's a very good question. If they do, I would be surprised if it were on immigration.
Yeah.
Especially from Patel. Because, as I said, Patel's biggest problem is that she is running from the right, and that she is a former Home Secretary in Boris Johnson's government, and Boris Johnson basically massively increased immigration. So I don't think Patel has the space, even if she wanted to make that particular argument. But there might be other areas. I think the most interesting policy questions, just for me, this might just be me as a policy geek, but I think there is something to it, is the ones that slice across the left-right split in a way that it's actually slightly harder to tell which is which. So take, for example, Miriam Cates. Obviously, she was defeated in the general election, but Miriam Cates, Conservative MP, who's written a lot about like family policy and taxation. Now, she wants to, for example, dramatically overhaul childcare so that it gives parents an awful lot more choice about whether or not they use childcare to either buy professional childcare or to support stay-at-home parenting. Now, this is, I think, a fascinating example, because it's like, which is the more right-wing position? The Cates position, that childcare should be flexible in order to give parents the option of staying at home and caring for their children, or the current position, that childcare should be structured around the economy and getting parents back into work as soon as humanly possible. Right? Which of those is more right-wing? So I think, for me, the reason I'm always slightly wary of this kind of left-right, do they move towards the centre or the right binary, is that really what the Conservatives need at this leadership contest and over the next 5 years is a complete update and overhaul of their thinking. Both sides of the current Conservative classic division are out of date. One of them is sort of stuck in 1975, but the other one, the sort of self-consciously modernising one, is stuck in 2005, when David Cameron became leader.
Right.
Neither of them seem to be oriented towards the problems of 2025 in the way that they need to be.
And it is interesting to have a Conservative leadership contest with so few grandees running. A couple of years ago, it may have been inconceivable that well-known figures like Michael Gove or Grant Shapps wouldn't be on the ballot. In Gove's case, it's because he stepped down as an MP. In Grant's case, because he didn't get re-elected. And both of those things do tell us something about the current state of the party. So in your view, what should a new leader prioritise in the short and medium term to be turning things around for the party fortunes?
In the short to medium term, one of the things that a new leader needs to do, the first thing a new leader needs to do is learn how to get good at opposition. It's a completely different skill to government.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in government, the media comes to you. And I think this is especially important for someone like Kemi, who has quite a spiky relationship with the media. When you're a minister or in government, the media comes to you. If you're a group of backbench MPs and you had a meeting, the press would come and cover it. That will no longer be the case. As of January 2025, you will need to go out and fight for every scrap of airtime. Second, someone really needs to overhaul CCHQ, that's Conservative Campaign Headquarters. It is an absolute mess. And there have been complaints about CCHQ for decades, but this...
Well, from Nadine Dorries, no less. She's chief among them.
And that is no reason not to think that they might have some substance to them.
Sure.
Even Nadine Dorries could be right twice a day. But yes, CCHQ is complete shambles, and this election really showed that. The institutional Conservative Party has been completely hollowed out, and CCHQ has just turned into this very short-term organisation entirely oriented around the next election and the marginal seats. There's nothing about cultivating long-term talent. There's nothing about maintaining permanently employed election agents, which the Conservative Party used to do. And we saw in this election where all this ends up, and it was absolutely awful. And then, and this is in policy, this is going to be very interesting. The Conservatives need, as I said earlier, to take the time to completely re-examine what their case to Britain is. Don't reheat, stick the Margaret Thatcher prospectus back in the microwave and then get it out. Don't do the same to what David Cameron was saying, because David Cameron was 20 years ago. Makes me feel very old to say it. But
tell me about it, Henry.
Right? But the advent of David Cameron's leadership was a long time ago. So take the time. And at the same time, avoid falling into some very obvious traps. And I think the biggest one of these is, for example, on planning.
I was going to ask you about that. So you're very pro home building, I think it's fair to say.
Yes.
And given Labour's commitment to reforming the planning laws and pretty ambitious housing targets, I would say probably not even ambitious enough given the compound problem we've got with it. But won't it be almost irresistible for the next Conservative leader to oppose them on that? And which of the six would you say is the least NIMBY, not in my backyard in terms of home building?
Well, this is one of the things that I'm going to be having my kind of Saronic eye on all of them during the Conservative leadership contest at Conservative Home. It's just what do you think about housing? Tell me.
Good for you.
It is an interesting question because, of course, two of them, and two of the people who we might say are within the favourites are Kemi Badenoch, who is currently Shadow Housing Secretary, and Robert Jenrick, who tried to deliver planning reform.
Yeah.
So they, I especially think, are in a bit of a bind because, yes, there are Conservative MPs who would love to do nothing more than just lapse back into the more homes, yes, but not here. I am writing to the Secretary of State about inappropriate development, save our greenbelt, all that nonsense, right?
Yeah.
And it might be that would help them save their seat, but it would basically do that by turning the Tories into a kind of just blue Liberal Democrat party, right? A constellation of local political militias with no national purpose. Now, I think the opening here is that, one, Labour's housing agenda, I think, has been so far quite disappointing. But the golden key, which I think gives all the Tory leadership campaigners something to campaign on, is Angela Rayner's decision to slash housing targets in London. This decision was insane, I think, and other urban areas, because whilst we do need housing in lots of other places, the places the housing crisis is most acute is London, Bristol, and our other big cities.
Indeed. I mean, we have a housing crisis nationally, but in some parts of the country, it's much more about the quality of homes rather than the quantity, as it very much, as you say, is in big cities.
Yeah, of course. And, it's one of the deeply frustrating... I've always hated this when Tory MPs do it. is that people would be like, oh, well, we believe in levelling up, so we have to put housing in the north. And it's like, well, but the housing's not the thing that the north doesn't have, right? I mean, especially in some areas which have actually had, shrinking populations since the height of the Industrial Revolution. The north needs infrastructure and all kinds of things that really needs investment, but just dumping housing targets there was like the bad faith Tory MP idea. And now Labour has done it. But this does mean that it gives the Tories a great in. Right, I wrote this on Conservative Home the other day. They can now be the party of building in inner cities. Like, I think they do need to build elsewhere, but if you're a Tory leadership candidate who wants to establish the party as having something worthwhile to say on housing, don't want to antagonise your MPs who want to, protect the view from little whinging, this is it. You can attack Labour on housing in cities. You can attack them on the way that rents in London rose by 25% over a handful of years, a couple of years ago. You can outline a real serious plan for an overhaul of the system that would allow you to build the flats that we need, the homes that we need, houses with gardens and so on. So this is a great get out of that trap that I mentioned earlier on housing for the Tory leadership candidates, is that they can focus on cities. It's areas like that. Labour will be making some controversial decisions in the course of this parliament in the pursuit of growth. Some of those will be bad decisions, but some of those will be good decisions which are very easy to attack because they're not popular.
Yeah.
And I think the Conservatives should take care not to launch easy opportunistic attacks against Labour when it is doing things that if they get into office they will probably have to do themselves.
'Twas ever thus. But yes, I hope that the winner of the Conservative leadership race channels Harold Macmillan in terms of its ambition. Let's get back to the kind of machinations and the kind of dark arts that go on. When we think back to leadership races of past, we've seen some very cunning moves. I'm thinking of when Eurosceptic Portillo supporter MPs switched to backing pro-European Ken Clarke to stop Eurosceptic Ian Duncan Smith. It was real kind of 4D chess stuff. Do you think we're going to see some similar trading in this race? I mean, I was looking at the number of declared MPs for a particular candidate earlier, and far fewer than 30 seem to have declared who they're backing so far. So are they genuinely making up their minds? Are they kind of keeping their powder dry for some of this trading? Do we know who Suella Braverman is backing? Give us any insider goss that you might hear bubbling up as to how all of this is going to play out.
Anyone who has read anything I've ever read about Suella Braverman will not be surprised that I am not privy to her secret thoughts about who she's going to endorse in the leadership. But for some of the others, yes, some of them are making up their minds. Some of them are also simply holding back their endorsement because we're about to go into parliamentary recess. If you're a Tory leadership candidate and you've got some MPs committed, you could go with them all now, or you can drip feed them out, right? So you try and maximise the attention that you get as best you can. In terms of the horse trading, it's interesting. The time we normally see horse trading is when it gets down to the final three, because there's not that much point in the early rounds, right? But once you're getting down to the final three, it's suddenly quite a big question, because it might be that, one of the final three would beat the other, the second person, but not the third. What we often see happen, allegedly, is that if the leader or the front runner is far enough ahead, they lend supporters to whichever they think the weaker of their two final three opponents is, to get them over the line and have an easier time in the final round. And the only time this doesn't seem to have happened, interestingly, was Rishi Sunak versus Liz Truss in 2022, because Sunak was not far enough ahead of Liz Truss to do that. That contest is the only time in recent memory that the two people we were talking about getting through to the final two at the beginning got through to the final two at the end.
Yeah.
Because neither of them was strong enough to sort of tip the other off. So my current expectation for who the final two will be is that it will probably be Tom Tugendhat on the One Nation wing versus either Robert Jenrick or Kemi Badenoch on the right as the final.
You heard it here first. Henry's calling it. What are the bookmakers saying?
Kemi is favourite currently with the bookies.
Yeah.
The reason I nominate those names is, first, there are two spots, and it's normally One Nation versus Right. So Tom has a big lead with the MPs, so he's probably, obviously don't want to jinx it for him, probably a lock to get into that final round. And then on the right, I think Patel, as I said, will really struggle with her legacy at the Home Office. So it comes down to Badenoch and Jenrick. Badenoch, the current favourite, but Stephen Bush of the FT has been one of the relatively few other people who's potentially called it for Jenrick so far. But we're a small group. But obviously, if he wins, you'll never hear the end of us. So,
okay. Well, final question, Henry, and this is moving on from how the MPs will vote to narrow it down to how the membership will do it. What are the odds that the next Conservative Party leader will be much more like an Ian Duncan Smith caretaker manager who kind of keeps the wheels on the bus for a couple of years before being replaced ahead of the next general election? And I'm asking this because I've read a fair amount of people saying that the membership will go for someone they like, but who may not be able to build sufficient electoral support to win. And they may be very, very popular with the party faithful, but there aren't enough votes across the country for that kind of leader to win at the next election. So, yeah, what's your view on that? Do you think this contest is going to deliver the leader that takes the party through to the next general election, or will be part of that kind of rebuild and doing all of the work that you said needs to be done in terms of reforming CCHQ?
My current, I actually wouldn't place it at a higher confidence level than suspicion, which probably says quite a lot about this contest, to be honest, is that the winner will probably make it through a 5-year term. But that might be because I think that the winner will be Robert Jenrick, who might not win the next election, but has thought enough about policy and has been a minister and the rest of it that I think he'd probably be able to just keep his leadership on the road. If you had Kemi win, again, Kemi has a lot of strengths, and it might be that she really grows into the office, but I think that given the reservations people have about Kemi with regards to her willingness and ability to endlessly fight for media attention and so on, that might be more of a case where actually we get 2 years in and it turns out that it isn't really working. The other thing will be how effective are they at landing blows on Labour? Because if you think about Ian Duncan Smith and what brought down Ian Duncan Smith, I mean, there were a lot of factors that brought down Ian Duncan Smith. We're not going to dust off the history books, but the main one was simply a sense that by 2003, Labour should have been in much more trouble than they were. And Tory MPs were really frustrated that they weren't managing to do what they felt, based on the trouble that Blair was having in office, they should be doing. Now, I think there will be a very similar point, inflection point, danger point for a Tory leader in this parliament, which is that in about 2 years in, Labour will have exhausted all of the legislation that it put in its initial King's Speech, and we will know whether or not it is going to be living up to the rhetoric around living standards, around per capita economic growth, around turning a corner. Now, if it hasn't done that, then two things happen. One, expectations from Conservative MPs will rise because Labour will have broken its promises and the economy will still be bad. Two, Starmer and Reeves might suddenly have to try and pivot to a different, more controversial economic agenda without having got it in the manifesto, which will upset their MPs. Again, divisions in the Labour government, expectations of Tory MPs go up. The danger point that any Tory leader has to surmount is when that happens, when we mentally switch from, oh my God, we just got nuked from space at the last election, to, all right, there's a weakness. We can scent blood in the water now. Can they deliver?
I lied. I said that was the final question. Final question, and it's a quick fire. Who wants it most?
Oh, that is an excellent question. Who wants it most? Robert Jenrick.
I agree. And listeners, I hope that has been a helpful gallop through the Conservative Party leadership race for you. I certainly feel like I've got a better grasp of it all now. So, Henry, thank you ever so much. Do join us again.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Quiet Rioters, if you've enjoyed the show, leave us a review, send feedback to quietriotpod@gmail.com, and we'll see you again very, very soon.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andrea and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sunstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
You can edit out this long, weighty pause while I think about it.